Good morning and welcome. On behalf of Voices from the Prairie, I'm Stephanie Van Oort-Strand. Thank you for joining us this morning for today's program discussing criminal justice reform. Voices from the Prairie is a transpartisan organization focused on civic education and engagement. We believe that the most powerful voice we have is found by informed voting and strive to provide information that enables us to do so. Our recent programs have focused on candidates and issues that impact us as individuals and our communities as a whole. We have covered topics including media impact, healthcare legislation, the importance of journalism, and environmental concerns. Past programs are available for viewing on our YouTube channel directly or linked from our public Facebook site. Today's program will be posted to the YouTube channel shortly. This morning, please help me to welcome Lindsay LaPointe, a Senior Project Manager for Justice Reform at Business and Professional People for the Public Interest, and our moderator, Rick Brooks, who will tell us more about Ms. LaPointe and justice reform programs.
I have to tell you, my interest in this topic is pretty old, and I was thinking of what got me interested, but among the things was an incident I was part of in Madison about 20 years ago, and I got up early to work, and it was about 6:30 in the morning, downtown Madison, and I met a guy walking along the street, and he wasn't particularly well dressed, and he looked very, very tired, and he came up to me and he asked me if I had any money that he could get some coffee, which was a familiar request. And I noticed that he had a cell phone. And I said, well, I was tired. And I said, you know, you have a cell phone and I can't afford one, and you're asking me for money. I said, tell me a little bit about your situation. He said, well, okay, I just got out of jail. He said, I was in jail I was arrested for vagrancy. And then he told me a couple more things, and he said, I couldn't get out of jail. I didn't have any bail, and I don't know whether he had a record or whatever else, but he said, I got out, and what you see me right now, this is what I have. This is the total of my life. He said, the cell phone is the only contact I have with my family, and they don't live here. And he said, I don't know where to go. I don't know where there's food. I don't know where to get a job. All I know is I could really use a cup of coffee. So it got me thinking about who goes to jail and why, how long do they stay, and what's that do for them, and what's that do for us as a society. And since that time, I've been looking for alternatives to the way we do things across the country. And I'm an inveterate TED Talk watcher, and I watched a piece on the bail project, where the people who raise money and pay the bail for folks who are in jail sounded an awful lot like we have little debtor prisons around the country. So I have my own opinions based on experience. I've not spent any time in jail. I've been to a few. I've been to some juvenile prisons around the country, and some of the worst. I've had my little tour in Alcatraz, and visited Cook County Jail a few times back when no human being would ever want to ever go inside those doors. So it became important to me to see how do we deal with the millions of people that are in jail, and what are the results of that? What might we do to make things better? So it was great that Jim Nolan recommended Lindsay come and see us and describe a program that she'll tell us lots about. It struck me that Bureau County is not part of it yet, but she can fill you in a little bit about what's going on in the rest of the state of Illinois. So Lindsay is a Senior Project Manager of Justice Reform at Business and Professional People in the Public Interest, BPI for short, in Chicago. At BPI, she leads initiatives on transforming community supervision, expanding alternatives to incarceration, and creating opportunities for reentry housing. Prior to BPI, she served in state government as the program manager for Adult Redeploy Illinois, where she worked closely with Illinois counties to plan and implement court-based alternatives to incarceration for individuals facing commitments to state prison. She holds a Master in Social Work from the Jane Addams School of Social Work at the University of Illinois and a BA from Grinnell College. A very good college with a sometimes not as great basketball team. Beloit College used to play them. My favorite player there was Thor, who I thought was 6'8" and 300 pounds. He was 5'8", but he was very good. So with that distraction, I will tell you that Lindsay's originally from the state of Maine. She says she began her career as a child welfare group home, homes, and has since worked in several direct social service positions before entering the world of criminal justice reform. She lives in the far northwest side of Chicago, but travels rural Illinois whenever she can. And it's great that she was willing to travel to see us today. So, Lindsay, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much. If I talk too much, someone just give me the time signal. I won't be offended whatsoever. I just want to kind of back up and tell you a little bit more about myself and how I got into the world of criminal justice reform, because I come from the world of social work, which you probably have an idea of what that is. And now that I work in policy on criminal justice reform, I end up working with a lot of lawyers and a lot of people that have public policy degrees, so I often feel like a fish out of water, but I've sort of gotten adjusted to it after many years. But the reason why, my little story about why I ended up being very interested in criminal justice reform was based on my experience working with people in homelessness in actually the suburbs of Chicago, in Maywood and Oak Park and Berwyn. I was doing that work, and I really didn't know a lot about the criminal justice system, but I was meeting people that were in homelessness, that had spent time in jail or prison, and I was also, that was creating a barrier to them getting out of homelessness, and they were trying to get jobs, but the fact that they had a criminal record, that was a barrier to them finding employment, was a trigger of mine to want to be more interested in this issue. And then I got to take a class in graduate school at UIC, and the issue just opened up for me, and I was really, really interested in it and got so lucky to land a job in it. Because I come from a social work background, one of the ways I look at this issue is, I look at it as a supreme failed social policy, and one of the reasons people end up in the criminal justice system is because we as a society don't do a good job helping people meet their needs, like health and housing and behavioral health issues, before they go into the criminal justice system. Then they go in, they don't get better, they come out, and we still do a pretty bad job helping people meet their needs. So that's part of the cycle that I see. So we can click to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the current problem of our over-incarceration of people, and sometimes we call it mass incarceration, and what the consequences of that have been. I'm going to touch on the current status of criminal justice reform, and then I'll talk about some solutions, including a program that I used to work in, Adult Redeploy Illinois. And through that work, this is one of the reasons I love rural Illinois, I was so lucky I got to travel all around the state and sit in courthouses and meet with judges and prosecutors and public defenders and people that work at treatment organizations. So my experience traveling all around the state and talking to people informs how I think about all this work, but it also informs how I think about just the state of Illinois in general. All right, next slide. Okay. The criminal justice system, I know I'm speaking to an audience who probably doesn't know a ton about the criminal justice system. And I think when a lot of people think about it, they think about jail, they think about prison, they think about the police, and that's all a part of it. It's actually more accurate to say criminal justice systems, and we have more than 3,000 of them in the United States. most of the criminal justice system in this country is actually administered at the county level. We have, of course, we have a federal system too, but about 88% of people that go into the criminal justice system and they start that entrance into the criminal justice system on the street with police generally. 88% of everyone that goes in is actually going in at the local county level. So when we talk about the federal criminal justice system, that's only about 12% of people going into the system. And in this country we have, I don't know what the number is exactly, but it's something like 3,500 counties, so that's why it's accurate to say, or more accurate to say, we have 3,000 plus criminal justice systems. So this map here is a very helpful way to think about our criminal justice systems. And whenever I talk to anyone about the criminal justice system, I always use this map, and it's, in my world, people are starting to reference it again and again. It's got a kind of weird name. It's called the sequential intercept map, and it was actually developed by people that work at the intersection of the behavioral health system and the criminal justice system. But the model is so helpful to think about the system that now we all use it. So basically, if you think about the criminal justice system like a map with 5 different steps, and before someone's in the criminal justice system, they're just living their life, they're over there. Once they start to come in, and generally that's street level policing is going to, we can use the word intercept somebody, then they start coming into the system and they're at step 1 with local law enforcement. And that's generally administered by a city or a town. If they keep going through the criminal justice system, the next step that they'll hit is initial court hearings and detention in the jail, in the local jail, and they'll appear in court. If somebody keeps going in the system, they will be detained in jail for a longer period of time, and they will have some court dates in front of them. So that's right in the middle. If they keep going into the system, they may or may not go to state prison, which is different than jail, and I'll explain that a little bit. They might have a stay of anywhere from 1 year to 40 years in state prison, and then when they come out, they're under, generally people are under a period of community supervision. A lot of states call that parole. You've probably heard that term. Technically in Illinois we don't have parole, so we have to call it mandatory supervised release. So this is your criminal justice system, and what I like to say, because I believe in the dire need for criminal justice reform, that you can see how people would flow through it when things are going badly and we're overusing the criminal justice system to meet needs that people have, but we're not doing a very good job of meeting those needs. People come in and they flow through the system, and it might take 5 years, it might take 20, they come out, and then it's a big circle. Then they just keep cycling through the system. And that cycling through the system is represented in our, what we call our recidivism rate, and not if you've heard that term, recidivism. Okay. Meaning when you come out, you go back into the system. And in general, the rate across the country, it depends on exactly how you're measuring it, but it tends to be about 50%. So half of people that come into the system will keep cycling. Now, when you're thinking about reform, there's so many different policies and programs that can help reduce the cycling of this system and lead to better public safety and more justice. And so this map is a helpful way to look at it because you can see, wow, you could do a special program with the police and you could train the police how better to deal with people dealing with mental health issues, and that might push somebody out of the system and get them out and get them what they need. If you want to do a special program at the court level, which is similar to the adult redeploy program that I worked in, so I'll talk about that in some detail. You might create something like a drug court where someone is coming in, they're in a court, but the judge has determined that they have an addiction problem, and if we, the system, can get them the services and the drug treatment that they need, they might move out of the criminal justice system and stop cycling. Just an example at the reentry level, in general, when people come out of state prison, they don't have a lot of resources. They don't have a lot of family ties. They might still have an addiction problem that they never got help for. They most probably do not have a place to live. So if we can set up programs to help people get access to treatment or maybe even short-term transitional housing when they come out of prison, we're giving them the tools they need to exit this system and stop cycling. So that's again, the sequential intercept map or the map of the criminal justice system is just a really helpful way to think about it. All right, so this is a snapshot of how many people are locked up in Illinois. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between jails and prison. But I mentioned that most people that go into the criminal justice system that are going to experience incarceration, most of that is happening at the county level. And you can see that here. We have some federal prisons in Illinois, so there are 7,600 people locked up in federal prison in Illinois, but the bulk of people here are locked up in state prisons, so we pay for those with our state budget and state tax dollars. Local jails, of course, are administered at the county level, and here in Illinois, these numbers are actually slightly outdated, but we have 21,000 people locked up in local jails, and I bet some people in this room know a little bit about the difference between prison and jail, but I'll just touch on it real quick, because a lot of times people use those words interchangeably. So jail exists at the county level, and jail is for people that either their case has not, what's the word I'm looking for? They're pre-trial. So they have been intercepted by law enforcement. It's alleged that they've committed a crime, and they are being detained in the local jail until either they have a trial, which is extremely rare actually, or what's more apt to happen is they come to a plea agreement and they plead guilty to some version of the charge that they were charged with. The really interesting thing about jail that we're starting to see more in the public eye now is kind of what I just described as pretrial detention. So people being detained before their case is fully adjudicated. And I'm not a lawyer, so sometimes I struggle with these terms, so bear with me as a social worker. But when you come in and it's alleged that you've committed a crime, we have a cash bail system here in Illinois and in I think almost every state. So the judge will say, if you pay, I'm going to issue you a bond of $50,000, and if you can pay 10% of that, you can go home and await trial in the community. If you do not have 10% of $50,000, then you have to stay locked up. So clearly that creates a system where the folks that have money don't have to await their trial incarcerated, but if you don't have money, you do have to await your trial incarcerated. And I know Cook County Jail the best because I live in Chicago, and it's a very big jail, unfortunately. Sometimes people are awaiting trial for years, and that's something the public generally doesn't know. And that means somebody is being detained in jail. They are still presumed innocent until their case plays out, and they might be there for 3 years. They might be there for 4 years. There's a lot of reform across the country and also in Illinois going on right now about ending cash bail and using different tools to help judges make decisions about who needs to be detained or not. Tools that have nothing to do with money, but tools that have to do with figuring out if somebody is a threat to flee and not return to court, and figuring out if somebody poses a risk of violence to the community, which in my mind are far better decision-making mechanisms than whether someone has the money to pay or not. Because with our current system, as you can imagine, it ends up that a lot of poor people are sitting in jail waiting for their trial because they just don't have the money to pay to get out on bond. Just as an example, in Cook County Jail, which is of course the biggest jail in the state by leaps and bounds, the recent stat was about 92% of everybody in Cook County Jail was there pre-trial. So that means only 8% of people were there because they were already convicted and they got a sentence of about 1 year, so they're just going to serve that sentence in jail rather than go to state prison. The national figure is that about 2/3 of people in all the jails all across the country are sitting there pre-trial, and they're detained because they don't have the money to get out. So this is a big issue that if you haven't heard of yet, you'll probably start to hear about it. State prisons are where people go when they have been convicted of a felony that has a sentence of more than a year. So when people are sent to the Illinois Department of Corrections here in Illinois, they're going to be there for more than a year. They'll be there from somewhere between 2 years to life in prison. And of course, as you know, the state prisons in Illinois are in large part in rural areas all over the state. And we do not have any facilities up by Chicago. All right, next slide. Okay. Just take a moment so you can read that.
Before you do that, where do people get their bail money? We talk about bail bonds a little bit, and what's the interest rate, do you think, on those?
Well, you know, I don't know too much about that, so I can't talk about that. I do know that in Illinois we don't have bail bondsmen, which a lot of other states have, which creates a special interest that has an incentive to keep the cash bail system. So as far as I know, people do a lot of scrounging from their friends and family to get that money paid.
I mean, it's not legal to have a bail bond system here?
Right, right. So what other social intervention has a cost of over $50 billion annually and a failure rate of 60 to 70% and has been tolerated for nearly 4 decades? So this speaks to something I actually haven't touched on yet, but hopefully it's implied. That whole criminal justice map that we were looking at, it's really, really, really expensive, and it's publicly funded. So we pay for that in our tax dollars, and when people quantify how much it costs over all those steps of the sequential intercept model that we were looking at, it's $50 billion annually. And there's different takes on what exactly the recidivism rate is depending on how you're measuring it. Are you looking at who gets rearrested, who gets locked up again? So this is, I would say, on the higher side, saying that there's a failure rate or recidivism rate of 60 to 70%. But even if it's 50, I mean, this is pretty bad social policy. It's very expensive, and the failure rate is really bad. And when you look at it like this, it makes me think of, wow, what if something like that was happening in our healthcare system? Would we tolerate that? Or in our educational system? So the sort of good news is the blowing up of our jails and prisons and our overuse of incarceration, it hasn't been going on forever, and it doesn't have to go on forever. And it's been going on for about the last 40 years. That the blowing up of our system started in the late 70s and the 80s, so it's just been about the last 40 years. So you can look at that in a dark way. I try to look at it in a positive way. Okay, we're coming out of the storm. We can do something about that. A big stat that a lot of people refer to that maybe you've heard of is the United States is 5% of the world, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners. So what that tells me, and why I think it's a very helpful stat, is we don't have to do this. And many other countries across the world don't use incarceration like we do. We are an anomaly. And thankfully, those numbers are they're starting to come down a little bit. So the next one is pretty mind-blowing. This is, in any given year, 13 million people are incarcerated, and that means in prison or jail. And another way to look at that is, in any given year, 1 in 20 people are behind bars. That's a lot of people. And on any given day, the number for the amount of people that we have behind bars is about 2.3 million. Community corrections. So this is a whole nother bucket of people that are in the criminal justice system. They're represented on that map that I showed you, but they're not locked up, but they are under what we call community corrections, or quote unquote community supervision. And something that a lot of people don't know, but people in my world are starting to pay attention to because it's really important, is the number of people under community supervision or on community corrections is actually way more than the number of people that we have incarcerated in prison and jail. On any given day, there's about 5 million people in our country that are under community supervision. So what is community supervision? It's generally one of 3 things. It's either parole, which again here we call mandatory supervised release, but when people are coming out of state prison, for most of those folks, they don't just get out of state prison and the state's totally done with them. For most of those folks, they are assigned a parole officer who is providing some level of surveillance for that person. Now, in an ideal world, the parole officer, in my opinion, is also providing some degree of services to this person, because the goal should be to maintain public safety and to help somebody not recidivate. And sometimes that means people are in need of services. Another form of community corrections is probation. And I guess you've probably heard of some of these words before. Probation, it's very similar to parole, except it happens at the county level, and when somebody is coming into the criminal justice system and they get arrested, let's say they get charged with a felony they come in front of a judge, and the judge says, we're not gonna send you to state prison, I'm gonna sentence you to a period of probation for 3 years. And a probation officer, just like a parole officer, will provide a degree of surveillance for the person, and in an ideal world, also help direct them to services if that's what they need. The whole community correction system is coming more under the spotlight, as I think it should be, because 5 million people are under community supervision. I have an optimistic look at or thought about community supervision. Historically, maybe unsurprisingly, these systems have not operated in a very rehabilitative way. They've operated in a way that's more about surveilling people and less about providing services to them. And a nice way of saying that I hear a lot of people say in my world is tail 'em, nail 'em, and jail 'em. So that's kind of the old school way of thinking about probation and parole. It's all about just surveilling somebody. And you can imagine if that's the protocol, it ends up tripping people up a lot, and they end up missing a drug test or missing an appointment or not applying to the 5 jobs that they said they were going to apply to, and they can get violated for that and sent back to prison. The newer way of doing community corrections is to do it in a way that is far more about rehabilitation, and there's certainly a degree of surveillance that is very necessary, but there's also a degree of figuring out what needs a person has, and maybe that is they need help finding a job, maybe it's that they have had behavioral health issues for a long time but have never been connected to the right services. So the new direction of community corrections in probation and at parole is to recognize that yes, people need surveillance, but they also need access to services. So probation and parole officers should be playing that dual role. And all the research shows that the more community corrections officers can play that dual role, the better outcomes we'll have, and people will be able to exit the criminal justice system.
And what's the client load of probation and parole officers? How many might they have to deal with?
That is a really excellent question. And it's a structural issue. So they range anywhere from 75 to 1 to 150 to 1, depending on what county you're in. In Cook County, there are some probation officers that have those really high caseloads of 150 to 1. So it's easy to think it's just because there's a lot of people in Cook County. But in some rural counties, it's just as high, because if we don't fund the probation office to pay the people to do the job, then there's going to be 5 probation officers and 1,500 people on probation. So the fact that we don't do a good job of paying attention to how many people are on community supervision, and then basically if we want to do community supervision differently and make it more rehabilitative, we have to fund it at that level. And because imagine yourself as a probation officer trying to act a little bit more like a social worker, trying to have conversations with your client, but if you have 149 people waiting out for you that need to see you, it's just not possible. So you're going to revert to the tail and nail and jail 'em. So another big picture thing that's really important, and a stat that I just, to be honest, this kind of blows my mind. But this is a national statistic put out by the National Employment Law Project. 1 in 3 people in the United States have a criminal record. And criminal record in this stat, it might mean they were just arrested. It might mean they were incarcerated. But that is a huge number. And this number is very relevant to the whole discussion of the barrier of a criminal record to employment and housing. Because we're getting a little better, but historically, if you have a criminal record, I mean, to be honest, it's still really tough. Getting a job is so difficult because employers just don't want to hire you, and we're making some law and policy changes in that department. But if you think about this number and how 1 in 3 people have a criminal record, if we don't change anything about this stringent barrier of a criminal record at that employer level or at the state level or even at the city level, we're making it really hard for about 33% of us humans here to have a successful life. And as you can imagine, what happens next, if someone doesn't have choices for viable employment, they might just keep engaging in criminal behavior and then cycle through the system. So 1 in 3 with a criminal record.
So the ban the box, people want to ban that little checkoff when you apply for a job. I presume they discuss it in training for human resource personnel. How do you deal with the person who's applying for a job if they're honest and they check the box if they have a criminal record?
That's right. That's right. And the ban the box is all about letting somebody get in the door for an interview, and then they can have that conversation and sell themselves. But if you have a box on the job application that says, have you ever been convicted of a felony, you're taking the rug out from someone and they don't have the chance to explain themselves.
Or a $3 background check for a daycare worker in a church on Sunday morning.
That's right. Yep. Okay, so we're reaching some consensus in this country that everything I just talked about is unsustainable. It's unsustainable because it is extremely expensive. There's a big human toll. There's a big toll for families. There's a big toll on our public budgets. And it's been about 40 years, but the numbers I showed you represent the peak of our use of incarceration. And in general, people are recognizing 2008 as the peak of our use of incarceration. So the good news is there's some growing consensus that everything I just talked about is a problem and we need to change it. And people of all political parties are coming to some consensus that this needs to change. Now, I'm going to just stereotype shorthand for a second, but the Democrats, the bleeding heart liberals, they want to change this system because of the huge human toll that exists. Again, I'm stereotyping here. The Republicans, they want to change the system because it's incredibly expensive and we're just literally wasting our tax dollars on a system that is giving us terrible outcomes. And then another group of people that we talk about sometimes when we talk about the consensus about criminal justice reform are people that are very motivated by their faith. Faith-based groups, because of the human toll of this system, have been a key stakeholder in the growing consensus that something needs to change. Can you go back to, there we go. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff, but this one's really important. Law enforcement, generally that's a group that's known as generally being more tough on crime and less open to rehabilitation. But even in the law enforcement community, nationally and locally, there's growing consensus that this system needs to change, and there are programs and policies that we can move forward on that will get better outcomes for us. And I want to read a quote that gets right into this from law enforcement leaders that came together at their annual meeting in 2015, representing the International Association of Chiefs of Police, because they said something publicly at this meeting that was a really big sea change. Here's what they said. As police chiefs who together have 70 years of experience managing crime, we firmly believe that we can reduce incarceration and crime at the same time. We know firsthand that more incarceration does not keep our country safe. Our experience and research shows that good crime control policy is not about locking up everyone. It's about locking up the right people. So that's a really provocative and profound statement from the well-established law enforcement community. Essentially what they're saying is locking people up does not make us safer. And of course, public safety is a bedrock thing related to everything I'm talking about. Everybody wants public safety. So what they're saying is, wow, locking people up actually makes us less safe, which of course is counterintuitive. And they're a very strong voice in this whole conversation. Just a brief word about politics and how related it is to public safety and criminal justice reform. When we think about politics and criminal justice, we tend to think about attorney generals. Like our current Jeff Sessions has a lot to say about this issue, of course. We think about governors because they control state budgets and they play a role in making state policy and they control the state prison system. We certainly think about state lawmakers because they have a big role in creating or rolling back policy. We certainly think about county level state's attorneys. They play a big role in kind of who's going to continue in the criminal justice system, who's not. But something that I have learned that's also really important is, in addition to electoral politics and how important it is in terms of if we're going to change something or not, what I like to call small p politics is really important. So whoever the director of probation is in a given county or a given judicial circuit, that's a really important stakeholder that, depending on how they think about all these issues, might change what's happening in a local county. Judges, a bunch of whom are elected, are a really important stakeholder on these issues. So politics is very important to these issues, but not just the big players that we tend to think about more often than not. Okay, I'm going to breeze through this a little bit because I already said that the really high numbers I was talking about, it's been recognized that 2008 is the peak of that, and a lot of counties across the United States and a lot of states are moving forward with certain reforms to change those numbers. Since we are here in Illinois, I just want to give you a snapshot of what is going on here. For a long time, the recidivism rate that we've recognized nationally, and it was also true in Illinois, was about 48%. So 48% of people that came through the criminal justice system would keep on cycling through. And interestingly enough, for a long time, the number of people that we had in our Illinois prison systems, so folks that have been convicted of a felony and are spending at least a year incarcerated, was about 48,000 people. That's a lot of people, 48,000 people. And that was on the pie chart that was up there earlier. Right now, those numbers are actually down here in Illinois. The prison population is, I've heard two different things recently. I've heard 43,000, which is a pretty big reduction from 48. I was at a meeting in early October with leaders from the Illinois Department of Corrections. They verbally said the population is down to 40,000. That's a pretty significant reduction. They also said this, to be honest, I mean, I haven't seen this in the press yet, but this is what DOC said at a meeting in early October, that the recidivism rate is actually down to 40%. So that's good. That's, I mean, it's not good compared to 0, but compared to what we've seen across the country of 50%, getting that recidivism down to 40% is pretty good. When Governor Rauner came into office in 2015, and as I'm sure you know, he's a Republican, he made criminal justice reform one of his key issues, and he, within a month of coming into office, he made an executive order that created